They celebrated my 72nd birthday by hiding me in the kitchen, and what they didn't know was that 48 hours earlier, I had already signed something that would change everything. I remember standing at the front door that evening, smoothing the sleeves of my navy blue dress, the one my late husband used to say made me look timeless. And for a moment, I let myself believe this night would be different, that maybe, just maybe, my family had remembered who I used to be to them, not just what I had become in their eyes. The house was already full when I stepped inside, the warm glow of chandelier lights spilling across polished hardwood floors, laughter echoing from the dining room, where the long oak table had been set with fine china, the kind I had collected piece by piece over 30 years. I paused there, just long enough to take it in, to notice how every chair was filled or reserved, little handwritten place cards marking each spot with careful attention, except mine. For a second, I thought there had been a mistake, that perhaps my card had slipped or been misplaced, but then Linda appeared at my side with that polished smile she wore like a perfectly fitted mask. "Oh, there you are," she said, her voice light, almost cheerful, as if nothing at all were out of place. She didn't hug me. She didn't wish me happy birthday. Instead, she gently placed her hand on my arm and guided me away from the dining room, away from the laughter, down the short hallway that led to the kitchen. "We thought you'd be more comfortable in here," she added, as though she were offering me a kindness, as though comfort and exclusion were the same thing. I didn't resist. I didn't ask questions. I simply let her lead me past the threshold, into the quieter, dimmer space where the hum of the refrigerator replaced the clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of conversation. There was a small table set near the back wall, not with china, but with a single plate, a folded napkin, and a glass that didn't match the others. I recognized it immediately. It was one of the older sets I had moved out of rotation years ago. "This way," Linda said, gesturing toward the chair as if presenting me with a seat of honor. I nodded, slowly lowering myself into it, my hands resting neatly in my lap, my back straight, my expression calm. From where I sat, I could still hear them in the next room, my son's voice rising above the others, warm and confident, so different from the quiet, hesitant boy who used to sit beside me at this very table asking if he could help set the plates. I wondered, briefly, when that version of him had disappeared, and whether I had missed the moment it happened. The kitchen smelled faintly of roasted chicken and something sweet, maybe the cake I had been told not to worry about this year, because they had it handled. I looked down at the place in front of me, at the single setting, and then back toward the doorway where the light from the dining room flickered with movement and shadows. No one came to check on me. No one called my name. And still, I smiled, just slightly, because as invisible as they had made me feel in that moment, I was holding on to a quiet certainty they couldn't see, something already set in motion, something that would make this seat in the kitchen the most expensive decision they had ever made. I sat there long enough to understand that it was not a mistake, not a moment of poor planning or a last-minute adjustment, but something deliberate, something decided well before I ever walked through that front door, and the realization settled quietly over me like a thin layer of dust that had been building for years without my noticing. The laughter from the dining room rose and fell in soft waves, punctuated by the clink of silverware against porcelain and the low hum of conversation that once would have included me without question, and I found myself listening not for words, but for tone, for the subtle shifts that reveal more than anything spoken out loud. Daniel's voice carried the most, confident and easy, as he told a story that made the others laugh, and I could almost picture him standing at the head of the table, one hand resting on the back of his chair, just as his father used to do. Except there was something different now, something rehearsed in the way he spoke, as if he were playing a role that no longer fit quite right. I folded my hands more tightly in my lap and let my eyes drift across the kitchen, taking in the small details I had once overlooked, the faint scratch along the countertop near the sink, the cabinet door that never quite closed all the way, the clock on the wall ticking steadily forward without any regard for what was happening in this house or to the people inside it. Time had a way of moving on, whether you were included or not. A burst of laughter came from the other room, louder this time, followed by Linda's voice, light and practiced, saying something about how much work it had taken to put the evening together, how she had wanted everything to be perfect, and I felt the smallest flicker of something in my chest, not quite anger, not quite sadness, but something colder, something clearer, like the moment when fog begins to lift and you finally see the shape of things as they truly are. I thought back to the past few years, to the subtle changes that had seemed so easy to dismiss at the time, the way decisions were made without asking me, the way my suggestions were acknowledged with polite smiles but quietly ignored, the way rooms in this house had shifted in purpose without my noticing until one day I realized I no longer had a place that was entirely mine. There had been moments, small and scattered, when I had felt the edges of this distance forming, but I had told myself it was natural, that families changed, that people grew into their own lives, and that my role was simply evolving. Sitting there now, in a kitchen that felt both familiar and strangely foreign, I understood that it had not been evolution at all, but a slow and careful repositioning, one that had placed me exactly where I was meant to be tonight, out of sight, out of mind, and out of the way. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me, and somewhere near the sink, a faucet dripped in a slow, steady rhythm, each drop marking the passing seconds as the celebration continued without me just a few steps away. I could have stood up then, could have walked back into the dining room and asked for my place, could have forced a conversation that would have made everyone uncomfortable and perhaps changed the course of the evening, but I did not move. Instead, I remained where I was, still and composed, because for the first time in a very long while, I was not trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away, and that quiet understanding gave me a kind of strength I had not expected. I reached for the glass in front of me, took a small sip of water, and set it back down with care, my movements precise, almost ceremonial, as if I were acknowledging something unspoken, a turning point that did not require witnesses to be real. In the next room, someone raised a toast, and I heard Daniel's voice again, steady and proud, speaking about family, about gratitude, about everything they had built together, and I closed my eyes for just a moment, not to escape the sound, but to listen more closely, to let it settle in, because what they believed in that moment, what they assumed about the future and their place in it, was already beginning to unravel in ways they could not yet imagine, and the only thing left for me to do was wait. The rhythm of the evening shifted again as footsteps approached the kitchen, lighter and more hesitant than the confident strides I had grown used to hearing from the dining room. And for the first time since I had been led to that chair, someone crossed the threshold and entered the space where I had been quietly placed. I looked up to see Sophie standing in the doorway, her hand resting against the frame as if she was unsure whether she was allowed to be there. Her expression caught somewhere between curiosity and discomfort, the kind that only comes when something feels wrong but has not yet been fully explained. She stepped inside slowly, her eyes moving from me to the small table and then back again, taking in the details that no one else had bothered to notice, and I saw the moment it registered, the moment she realized that this was not simply an extra seat, but a deliberate one. "Grandma," she said softly, her voice careful, as if she were afraid of saying the wrong thing. "Why are you sitting in here?" I smiled at her, the same gentle expression I had used for years whenever she asked questions that deserved more than simple answers. But tonight, the truth did not feel heavy in the same way it once might have. "They thought I would be more comfortable," I replied, my tone even, my hands still folded neatly in my lap, and she frowned slightly, her young face tightening in a way that reminded me so much of Daniel when he was her age, before everything became so complicated. She glanced back toward the dining room, where the laughter continued as if nothing were out of place, and then leaned a little closer to me, lowering her voice as though she were sharing something she was not supposed to say. "Mom said you might feel tired," she whispered, "and that it would be better if you stayed in here, so you would not get overwhelmed." The words were simple, almost reasonable on the surface, but there was something underneath them, something in the way Sophie hesitated after saying them, as if she knew they did not quite match what she was seeing with her own eyes. I held her gaze for a moment, and in that quiet exchange, I understood more than she had intended to reveal, not just about what had been said, but about how it had been framed, how concern had been used as a softer way to justify distance, how exclusion had been dressed up as kindness. "And what do you think?" I asked gently, not to challenge her, but to give her space to trust her own instincts, and she looked down at the table again, then back at me, her brow furrowing as she searched for the right words. "I think you should be out there," she said finally, her voice a little stronger now, more certain, and something in her answer settled quietly inside me, not because I needed her validation, but because it confirmed that the truth was still visible to those who were willing to see it. I reached out and placed my hand lightly over hers, the warmth of her skin grounding in a way that felt both familiar and fleeting, and I gave her a small nod. Sometimes, I said, choosing my words with care, where people place you says more about them than it does about you. She held on to that for a moment, her eyes searching mine as if she was trying to understand something larger than the situation in front of her, and then she straightened slightly, glancing once more toward the doorway. "Do you want me to tell them you should come back?" she asked, and I shook my head, slowly and without hesitation. "No," I said, my voice steady, because for the first time, I did not feel the need to step back into a place that had already been taken from me. Sophie hesitated, then nodded, accepting my answer even if she did not fully understand it. And as she turned to leave, she paused at the doorway and looked back one more time, her expression thoughtful, as though she was carrying this moment with her in a way that might matter later. When she was gone, the kitchen felt quiet again, but not in the same way as before, and I sat there with my hands resting lightly on the table, aware that something had shifted, not in the room around me, but within the story itself, because even the smallest witness can change how the truth unfolds, and Sophie had just seen something that could not be easily forgotten. The evening was beginning to settle into its final shape, the kind that feels complete to those who believe everything has gone exactly as planned, and I could hear the soft rhythm of departure forming in the other room, coats being gathered, chairs pushed back, voices lowering into polite goodbyes that carried just enough warmth to leave a lasting impression. I remained in the kitchen, not hidden now, but simply apart, and there was a difference in that, one that only I seemed to recognize. I moved toward the sink and rinsed the untouched plate in front of me, not because it needed to be done, but because the motion felt familiar, grounding, a quiet ritual that belonged to me alone, untouched by the shifts that had taken place elsewhere in the house. As the water ran, I could hear Linda thanking their guests, her voice steady and composed, the perfect host until the very end, and I imagined the way she stood there, smiling, confident in the role she had claimed, unaware that the story she believed she was securing had already begun to unravel beyond her reach. Daniel's voice followed hers, offering his own thanks, his tone, carrying that same assurance, that same belief that everything was in order, that the future would unfold just as they expected, with no surprises waiting beneath the surface. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands slowly, each movement deliberate, because there was no need to rush toward what came next. The front door opened and closed several times as guests filtered out, their footsteps fading into the night, leaving behind a quieter house that felt larger than it had just hours before, not because the space had changed, but because the illusion of togetherness had been carefully packed away along with the evening's formalities. Eventually, the voices drew closer, and I could hear Daniel and Linda moving through the hallway, their conversation softer now, less performative, more reflective of who they were when no one else was watching. "It went perfectly," Linda said, and there was a note of satisfaction in her voice that did not need to be hidden. "Everyone had such a great time," Daniel agreed, his response easy, unchallenged, as though there was nothing worth questioning, nothing that required a second thought. Their footsteps paused just outside the kitchen, and for a brief moment, I wondered if they would come in, if they would remember that I was still there. But instead, the conversation shifted, moving past me as if I were simply another piece of furniture, something that existed but did not require acknowledgement. I did not call out. I did not step forward. I simply stood there, listening as they continued down the hall, their voices fading once again, leaving me alone with the quiet certainty that had been building all evening. I walked slowly toward the back door and rested my hand on the handle, feeling the cool metal beneath my palm, and I paused there, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because this moment marked something final, something that did not need to be announced to be real. Behind me, the house remained as it had always been, filled with memories that no longer held the same weight, shaped by relationships that had quietly redefined themselves without my consent. But ahead of me, there was something else entirely. Something not yet formed, but undeniably mine. I opened the door and stepped outside into the cool night air, drawing in a steady breath as the silence wrapped around me. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to feel the full extent of what had changed, not as a loss, but as a release, because everything they believed they had secured inside that house, every assumption they had made about what would remain theirs, was already shifting in ways they could not see. And by the time they realized it, the version of me they had placed in that kitchen would no longer be there to accept it. The night air felt cooler than I expected, carrying with it a stillness that made everything inside the house seem distant, as though it belonged to a different version of my life that I had already stepped away from. And I stood there for a moment on the back porch, letting that quiet settle around me without resistance. Through the window, I could still see the soft glow of the lights inside, silhouettes moving slowly as Daniel and Linda finished clearing the remains of the evening, their gestures unhurried, comfortable, unaware that anything had shifted beyond the surface of what they could see. I wondered, not with bitterness but with a kind of detached curiosity, how long it would take for them to notice the absence, not of my presence, but of what they believed was still waiting for them in the future they had so confidently assumed. The answer would not come tonight, and that was part of what made it so certain, because the most significant changes rarely announce themselves in the moment they occur. They reveal themselves later, in quiet realizations that cannot be undone. I stepped down from the porch and onto the path leading away from the house, each step measured and steady, not as an escape, but as a continuation, a movement forward that no longer required permission or acknowledgement from anyone else. The gravel beneath my shoes shifted softly with each step, a small, grounding sound that reminded me I was still present, still moving, still capable of choosing what came next without needing to explain it to anyone. Behind me, the door remained closed, the light still shining through the glass, holding everything they believed to be intact within its frame, and I did not look back again, because there was nothing there that required my attention anymore. My thoughts returned briefly to the document resting in Mr. Collins's office, to the precise language that had been chosen with such care, the conditions that would only matter once they were tested, once the assumptions they had built their certainty on began to fall away piece by piece. It was not an act of punishment, not in the way they might one day describe it, but rather a reflection of what had already taken place, a quiet acknowledgement that respect cannot be separated from consequence, and that what is given without regard can just as easily be withdrawn without warning. I reached the end of the path and paused, feeling the open space around me expand in a way that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome, and I realized that for the first time in a very long while, my life was not defined by where I was expected to be, but by where I chose to go next. Somewhere behind those walls, they were finishing the evening, perhaps already speaking about plans, about what would come after, about things they believed were already theirs. And I let that thought pass without holding on to it, because it no longer belonged to me to correct them, to warn them, or to guide them toward a different understanding. Some truths are not meant to be explained in advance. They are meant to be discovered when the time comes, when there is no longer any room to deny them. I drew in a slow breath and continued walking, the night stretching out ahead of me in quiet certainty, and I carried with me not the weight of what had been taken, but the clarity of what I had already set in motion, because they had chosen where to place me without ever asking who I had become, and in doing so, they had made a decision that would shape everything that followed, even if they would not realize it until they found themselves standing at a table that no longer had a place for them at all.